Well, thank you, Mark. And again, you are welcome to those resources in the QR code. I haven't arranged them very well, so you just got to go poking around, but they're fairly well labeled. I teach a course on the life of Christ, and I'm constantly updating the notes. They're pretty expensive. Not at all, they're free, but they're pretty extensive. And those are on there, just and so a lot of the details and so on I try and address in those notes. I thought it would be good just to begin. I don't know if this is a burning question with anybody, but there is a lot of debate and question about the day of the week on which Jesus died. Are you familiar with this? Has anybody heard have you heard that he died on Thursday? Have you run into that? Our what's that? The 3 days and 3 nights. That's exactly right. Our pastor is going through Luke, and he believes, and on the basis of 3 days and 3 nights, he preached, did a nice job of defending it, preached a Thursday crucifixion. And so it's certainly not heretical. But, okay, let's put it this way. Every indication, honest to goodness, and I believe in Friday, that's what I've taught you, but every indication in the biblical record, and they're very, very compelling, is that Jesus died on a Friday, all right? I won't expand on that, but the thing is, just as you say, the problem is the 3 days and 3 nights, and that's a legitimate problem. Now, do you have your booklet? I left mine right here. In the back of the book, there is an appendix, and the first one is on the day, no, the second one on the day Jesus was crucified. And what I do here is I try and go through the three positions. Some believe Wednesday, not very many, but I ran across it not too long ago. The most popular on the Friday is Thursday, and then the overwhelming consensus. But again, that is not probative. That doesn't prove anything. But the overwhelming consensus is Friday. But the problem is Matthew 12 and verse 40, where Jesus says, as Jonah was in the heart of the earth for 3 days, in the belly of the fish, I'll be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. And so and that's the only place. Now, that's enough for me. It's true if it's only one place. On the other hand, there are about 42 times where it says explicitly that Jesus rose on the third day. Remember all of those times that the gospel in 1 Corinthians 15, the gospel is this, that Jesus died according to Scripture, he was buried and rose again on the third day. Again and again, as Jesus foretells that he's going to die, he'll say, on the third day I will rise again. So about 42 times you have. So what do we know for sure, folks? We know that that on the third day is the same as 3 days and 3 nights, because the Bible is absolutely inerrant. So we've got a bit of an issue in either direction. This, I think, this satisfies me. If you go to page 43, I give you a critique of the Friday view and a reply to the critique. And it's just a chart I put together years ago. But under letter C, under letter C on page 43, I make that point that in the Scriptures, on the third day is synonymous with 3 days and 3 nights. There are a couple of places where, and one of them is there. But you remember when David was he was fleeing from Saul, and he came back to the city of Ziklag, and the Amalekites had carried off all of his family, and he strengthened himself in the Lord and set out to recapture his family and so on. And they caught a slave who had been abandoned by the fleeing Amalekites. And he said, "How long has it been?" And he said, "I haven't eaten anything for 3 days and 3 nights, because it's now the third day since they abandoned me." So you have them just in parallel. They're the same thing. Well, how can they be? And I think letter D there is really a hugely helpful, and this is appealed to in every quarter. But in the Talmud, that library of Jewish literature and commentary over the years and so on, a rabbi from the first century. Now, I got to stop and say that the Talmud is not from the first century, it's from the third century, but it remembers a rabbi from the first century who is actually talking about the Jonah episode. And he wants he's trying to help you understand what they mean, what the scriptures mean by 3 days and 3 nights. And he says this. He says, a day and night are an onah. Now, that word just means a unit. And then he says, that is a portion of time, a unit. Then he says, the portion of an onah is as the whole of it. So a day night, they're not, breaking down into 72 hours and 24 hours and so on. But a daylight period and night period are together a day night, and any portion is as the whole of it. That makes sense? Now it's strange to our Western ears, but that's Jewish testimony as to how they use the language. And what he is saying is, or the way we would apply it is that he's in the grave on Friday, only a part of it, but any part of it is as the whole of it, all day Saturday, and then early Sunday, and so by Jewish reckoning, he is in 3-day nights. Let's say it this way: 3-day nights, 3 days/nights, because it's a unit. That makes sense. Now I'll tell you one other thing, and I never seen anybody else appeal to this. But you remember that I mentioned that, and this is indisputable, that by Jewish, in that culture, when a person died, you can attend to his body for 3 days. But as the sun went down on the third day, you rolled the stone over the tomb because of the stench. Remember that? And we know that because Martha is so horrified. No, it's the 4th day. That's what she says. Remember that? He's going to stink. You don't open the grave on the 4th day. Well, what were those women going to do on Sunday morning? He died on Thursday, that's day 1. Day 2 is Friday, and day 3 is Saturday, and the tomb is closed. So the tomb is not, Jesus' body is not available to be attended to on the 4th day. Does that make sense to you? So I think that's another. I'm going to say again, though, that it's entirely a fraternal, irenic issue. All right, and it's a legitimate issue. I think the best explanation is Friday. Now, with your leave, I'd like to deal with one other issue because it's really big, and it may be just a little technical, save me 3 or 4 minutes. But if you take your Bible and go to John 18 and verse 28, we're not using the screen tonight, but John 18:28, and this is where Jesus is brought from the Caiaphas, from the Jewish trial that we talked about, to the praetorium, to Pilate. And the verse says that the Jewish accusers did not go into the praetorium. As a matter of fact, they made Pilate bring the judicial apparatus out into that gate system. But it says that they didn't go into the praetorium because they didn't want to defile themselves in order that they might eat the Passover. Now, I told you this morning that there is a constant, and I think wicked attempt to discredit the Gospels by finding contradictions. And most of the times it's John versus the synoptics. You know, the synoptics are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They all see about the same thing, synoptic. And this is the big one. The argument that they think has the most force is the fact that on the one hand, in the synoptics, Jesus eats the Passover with his disciples on Thursday. Then he's arrested, and later that night, the Pharisees don't want to go into a Gentile house so that they can eat the Passover. Well, wait a minute. The Passover is over. And this is a absolute go-to, slam dunk, proves that John is writing late. He's making things up, and now it's a problem. There are several ways to deal with the problem. One way is, some have said, some have argued. All right, I'm going to stop. Let me just say this. The Bible is inerrant. The Bible is the Word of God. Now, I'm not going to prove it inerrant. I'm not interested in that. But when I go to the Scriptures, any part, And I'm confronted with what seems to be a mistake, whether it's an inconsistency with extra biblical history or some internal contradiction. I know that it's true in all of its parts. The problem is I haven't done enough work, maybe. Does that make sense to you? And furthermore, when you're confronted with that accusation of indisputable error in the scriptures, in many cases, and this is one of them, all we can do today is come up with rational explanations. And we can't be absolutely sure which of those explanations is best. Does that make sense to you? And it's almost always because of a lack of information from the extra biblical side. I'm not going to illustrate, but my point is this. The challenge is here is an absolutely undeniable error. So the Bible is in error. We come back and we say, well, this would explain it, this would explain it, or this would explain it. We have broken the force of that charge. Does that make sense? Now, the critic will always say, not good enough, not good enough. You got to prove exactly. Right? No, I don't. The issue is not we can uncover every single detail and settle every perceived problem. The charge is the Bible has a mistake. And we're saying, no, it doesn't. But, all right, so that makes sense to you? It's really an important issue. But so the point is, some have said, well, there were a number of ritual meals during the Passover 8-day week, and perhaps they want to be able to continue to eat through the rest of the week. I don't think that works, but it's reasonable. Arnie Fruchtenbaum, you know that name, REL Ministries, a very important voice. But Fruchtenbaum, he's got a rich rabbinical background, and before he was a believer. But he says that by reason of the fact that the priests were so busy slaughtering all those lambs on Thursday night, they didn't have time to keep Passover, so they had their own meal on Friday morning. And he goes to the Talmud, and not to my satisfaction absolutely convincingly, but he makes that suggestion. That makes sense to you? It would make sense. It would explain why the Pharisees are yet to eat the Passover. Now, let me give you what I think is the best one. This is a little bit complicated, but I think it's worth maybe the effort. All right. And this is the work of Harold Hoehner in his book, Chronological Aspects. And he's gone to be with Jesus, but he was an unspeakably important New Testament scholar, gospel scholar, chronologist. But he suggests this, the Jewish day began when? At sundown, right? Sundown to sundown. And that was just the way everybody lived down in Judea, Jerusalem, where there was nothing but Jews. In Galilee, because there were so many Gentiles, and so many Gentiles who were meaningfully involved in the way they lived and so on, and because it was universal everywhere else in the world, that the Galileans began colloquially, just informally, to live by a sun-up to sun-up, the way the rest of the world did. And I always illustrate it this way: if you know it's well, if this afternoon I were to say to you, why don't you come over and have dinner with us tomorrow? By Jewish reckoning, when would that be? Right now, tonight, right? In Galilee, if I were to say to you, why don't you come over tomorrow? It would be tomorrow. Does that make sense? Now, it has nothing to do with it. Read the Bible. It was very local. But Hoehner demonstrates that this was just kind of a local dialectic thing, kind of dialect. I don't know. I'm not saying that well. But then he points out, and this is true, this is very, very important. As I say, those lambs had to be slain on Nisan 14 between about 3 in the afternoon and about 7:30. And there were literally hundreds of thousands of them. Now, I talked to you about the assembly line they had set up and so on, so they could do it. I mean, but they just couldn't get them all done. And so he suggests, with some incidental, I think evidences, that the priests had simply said, look, we can't get it all done on one day, but it has to happen on Nisan 14. But if we allow the Galileans to live by their habits of life, then Nisan 14 begins Thursday morning. So between the evenings would be Thursday afternoon. And then they would go, because the Bible doesn't say on what day you eat the meal. It says you slay it on Nisan 14, and then when the sun goes down, you go inside and eat it. So the Galileans, in order to get everything done, the Galileans, using their kind of colloquial understanding of a day, they would slay the lamb. There would be a Passover lamb slaying for the Galileans, for the non-Judeans, on Thursday. But then, for the Judeans, Nisan 14 only begins when the sun goes down. So now between the evenings is the next day, Friday, from about 3 to 7:30. That makes sense? So there would be 2 days of Passover lamb slaying, but in both cases, it would be on Nisan 14. That makes sense? And therefore, Jesus, a Galilean, ate it on Thursday. Now, the reason I like that is there are a couple of other ramifications to it. One, and who in the world would worry about this but me maybe, but it always has seemed just a little bit presumptuous, and if anybody in human history has a right to be presumptuous, it would be Jesus. But it seems a little presumptuous to ask Mary if he could use their beautiful upper room outfitted for a feast for Passover. She's got a family. You know what I'm saying? If I called and said, hey, our family would like to gather, we'd like to use your living room, on December 25th. Does that work for you? I'd say, well, I don't know. I kind of had plans. So now, again, I'm sure if Jesus asked, Mary would have given it to him. But see, by this light, Mary is not going to eat. She's a Judean, so she's not going to have Passover till the next day. Does that make sense? So Jesus could legitimately ask to have a Galilean Passover, if you don't mind, on Thursday. And the other thing that I really like about this, and maybe this is what talks me into it, some ideas, you just because they preach well, you go for them. But if that's the case, Jesus dies at what time? Come on, 3 in the afternoon. What else happens at 3 in the afternoon? The Passover lambs begin to be slain. So the gates are thrown open, first of all, on Thursday, and that Passover lamb, that's when Jesus, Peter and John brought their Passover lamb and ate it that night. But now on Friday afternoon, once again, the doors are thrown open and the trumpets are blown, and they begin to sacrifice the Passover lambs just as Jesus is dying. I think it's kind of an interesting and maybe deliberate. So at any rate, I take you there, and it's a little heavy, but I'm telling you, the real issue that I want to address, and we could address dozens of these, quite honestly, in the Gospels, but this claim that the Gospels are entirely irreconcilable and contradictory, it's an absolute lie, and you take it piece by piece, and some of them you can be a lot more confident as to how to solve the perceived riddle, and other times you just say, no, it could be this, could be this. Either way, don't be telling me you've proven an error in the Bible. You haven't. Does that make sense to you? All right. Other questions here.
Oh, come on. It's a Q&A.
I'm telling you, otherwise.
Okay, Lisa.
What is your opinion, or where do you believe Jesus' body and spirit was between burial and resurrection?
Very, very good question. Now listen, this is there are 2 passages, and I'm going to give it to you with one hand and take it back with the other. Okay? There are 2 passages. It is Ephesians 4 and 1 Peter 3. And Ephesians 4 talks about this one who, the one who ascended is also the one who descended into the lowest parts of the earth and led captivity captive. And that is, and this is what I was taught when I was growing up. This is, in Bible college, so this is pretty much given. And the idea was that after Jesus physically died, his soul spirit descended to Abraham, the region of Hades, the region of the dead. And we know from the story or parable, I still think it's a story of Lazarus and the rich man, that, you have this place of the redeemed, and then the place of the condemned, and the place of the redeemed is called Abraham's bosom, and he led those soul spirits to heaven. He led captivity. In other words, they had to be, until Jesus actually died, it was inappropriate for even the redeemed souls to be in the presence of God. It had to be real. And so now that it's real, there was a place, Abraham's bosom, where they were kept in delight, but now they're led to heaven, right? That's the standard. And this is sometimes called the two-compartment theory. Because you have these two compartments that are reflected in that story of Lazarus, and now the righteous are wafted off to heaven. Now, here's the problem. I rather believe that that's what's at stake. Most don't. Because, and this is very legitimate, that passage is entirely liable to a different reading, just as legitimate, that has nothing, it means it has nothing to do with Jesus' experience in the grave. And that is that he that descended is not a reference. He that ascended is also he that descended. It's a reference to the incarnation. It's just his coming to earth. And leading captivity captive is simply the work of redemption. Does that make sense to you? You can read that passage. He who ascended, that's going back to heaven, is also he that descended, just in the incarnation. And by reason of that, he was able to lead captive souls, you and me, to lead captivity captive to the Lord. So you've got two very legitimate readings of, that makes sense? Either during the time of the grave, he went into, and the lowest parts of the earth seems to suggest that. All it can mean, compared to heaven, the earth is the lowest parts, So, like I say, it's hard to be very dogmatic about it, to be honest with you. Does that make sense?
So do you believe he saw the Father before?
You know what? If you take away those two passages, and I have yet to deal with the second one, I can do it quickly. I don't think we have any information about, in other words, unless you want to appeal to the normal condition of the normal experience of a person who dies, but I don't know of any other passages that would speak specifically to the experience, the situation, or whatever of Jesus during his days in the grave. Now, I'm just doing this off the top of my head. Anybody else? Can you think of anything? So now, I do think, I said it this morning, that what Jesus said to that thief, and I think he pulled the curtain back a little bit with the Lazarus story. That is, the Lazarus and the rich man, because Lazarus is wafted off to heaven, to paradise. So I would expect that, I think we can be confident that Jesus did, because Jesus said to that thief, today you'll be with me in paradise. Now, did he mean Abraham's bosom, or did he mean glory? I don't know. I mean, so it's a very good question. I don't think it touches anything really fundamental to our faith. It's just that there is this interesting question. Now, let me say two other things about it real quickly. Number one, with regard to the first Peter says, and I can't quote it very carefully, but that by the Spirit he preached the gospel to those who are now in prison, who in the days of Noah rebelled. And if that is taken to be his ministry during the 3 days in the grave, then this is something very different. And the idea seems to be that there were those who rejected the truth in Noah's day. Now they find themselves in the bad half of that compartment. And Jesus comes down and preaches. Now the word is preach in the King James, but it's actually kirux. It's announced his victory. And so in this case, it's just Jesus goes to, I don't know, it's kind of a grand, forgive me, this is a nana moment, you know what I'm saying? He just went down and said, you should have listened, shouldn't you, So now, so that makes sense to you? That becomes those two ideas. Number one, he went down and but delivered the saints under the Old Testament, took them back to heaven. And number two, he went down to the place of the condemned and announced his victory, and you should have listened. But that verse 2 is liable to a very different, legitimate reading, and that is not that Jesus went in his spirit and announced and preached, but that Noah preached in the spirit of Messiah in his day. So it's not saying that Jesus, it's saying that the ones to whom Noah preached now are confronted with their, they realize their mistake, their wickedness. Or did Jesus go down? I'm not saying that well. But what it comes down to is you have these two passages where we have historically, I think in our circles anyway, we've been taught that this represents the ministry of Jesus during the 3 days in the grave. Both passages are liable to a different reading, which is just as doctrinal, just as healthy and so on, but it has nothing to do with Jesus' ministry. So it like I say, I take it, give it with one hand, take it back with the other. So when I get all done, I don't. Now I'll say this, that what I like about the first of those, the Ephesians 4 passage, is this. Folks, the Spirit of God has a ministry to you and to me that he did not have to the Old Testament saint. Would you not agree? Something happened at Pentecost, for heaven's sakes. And we have this, what's called, Larry Pettigrew, kind of the new covenant ministry of the Holy Spirit. And it's ours by reason of the finished work of Jesus. And so I wonder if there's not a parallel. This is getting heavy, but on the one hand, the Spirit of God could not come to be with us with the kind of intimacy then that he can now because of the finished work. So is it fair to say that the saints could not go to be with God in the same intimate sense? That makes sense at all. What I get out of that, and I do think it's an important reality, is listen, and I mean, sounds totally sophomoric and truistic, but it needs to be said. Jesus' death really made a difference. What God could do and what the Spirit could do in your life, Jesus' death made a difference. Now, let me go a step further, get a little dry, and talk about this real quickly. We say that, okay, in the Old Testament, the Spirit of God didn't have the ministry that he does today. Is that because he was sleeping late and wasn't working very hard? No, it was because I'm convinced, if you could get a peek in the Holy Spirit's tool bag, there'd be one tool, and that is truth, revealed truth. The ministry of the Spirit is to take what God has made known to man and press it home to your heart. And now think how the Spirit of God is advantaged to have the whole body of new covenant truth, this death and burial and resurrection of this God-man. And so the Spirit of God has a great deal more equipment. But I'll go back to it nonetheless. That's not just sort of a hypothetical. It's a very practical, real difference that the Spirit of God today has the entire New Testament, for heaven's sakes, that he can press home to your heart, and that's his office work. And he didn't have that in the Old Testament. Does that make sense to you? So that's why I think it's important to distinguish. I think there is a real, and by the same token, might I say, I don't think it would be appropriate. Now, I'm really out on a limb here. But if you can imagine, here's this Old Testament saint, and he has trusted Yahweh. Look, how did you get saved in the Old Testament? Just like you do in the New Testament, except for this. The body of knowledge, you trust God's promises. But we have greater promises than they did. I will argue that Leviticus 17:11, it's talking about the Day of Atonement, is the John 3:16 of the Old Testament. And Leviticus 17:11 says this: the life of the flesh is in the blood. I've given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your soul. The blood of what? The blood of an animal. I think the Old Testament saint probably wondered in his mind, how is it that God can accept the blood of an animal on my behalf? I don't understand that, but I have a promise. The blood of an animal, that day on the Day of Atonement, the blood shall make atonement for your soul. Now that's what I'm clinging to. That's what I'm trusting in. Does that make sense to you? But Jesus comes, and Paul says, now we understand how God can be at once just and the justifier of them that believe, because Jesus has offered up that infinite sacrifice. And now we, again, this is the blessedness of this dispensation, this age. But the point I started to make was that I think it would almost be inappropriate for the Old Testament saint, after he dies, to be wafted right into the presence of God, when in point of fact, a real sufficient sacrifice has not yet been made. And I think that's what Paul means when he says the sins of the Old Testament saint were passed over. That's Romans 3, about verse 20. He passed over the sins of those who went before the Old Testament saint. I like to say, McCune used to say, the Old Testament saint was saved on credit. And it was the blood of Christ that paid that all off and paid everything else off. But he didn't know that. The Old Testament saint didn't know that. I don't know. I don't do brief. Wait, Jim, you're going to ask. Go ahead.
You want to say it in here? Excuse me, Doc.
I'm making trouble.
Yeah, I just had, is this on?
Yeah.
In John 20, after the resurrection and Mary comes to the tomb, and then she recognizes that it is Jesus. He says to her, touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father.
Mm-hmm.
But go to my brethren and say unto them, I am ascended unto my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. Almost contradicts itself. I wonder if you could explain that.
Yeah, and later on he invites Thomas to thrust his hand in. Here he says, this is the moment of the discovery. This is the Sunday morning, and Mary realizes who it is, and he says, touch me not. I think it would be better translated. I mean, this is a perfectly legitimate translation. Don't cling to me. In other words, don't think I'm here to stay. I think that's all he means. He's got to be very, very careful about, if you don't mind, controlling the emotional response. You can imagine. And he has said he's going to go to his Father. He said it again and again. He said, if I don't go, the Comforter will not come, in John 16. So I think he's saying, now, calm down, don't cling to me. Don't think I'm here to stay. That verse is sometimes appealed to in defense of the led captivity captive, because some people say this was a stop along the way. He had come from Hades Hades is just the place of the dead, and with the souls of the Old Testament saints, and he says, don't touch me because I got to go and get fully sanctified or something like that. I don't think that's what's at stake, but it is a tough reference. But I think he is saying, and I will say too that, and maybe I'm claiming too much high ground here, but whenever you come to those those elements of the narrative that seems a little strange, work very hard to get into the narrative. That moment, what's going on? And some people get after that. One of the areas I keep saying that you have these critics who attack the scriptures, and one of the areas where they like to attack the scriptures is the resurrection narratives, because you got people going here and there. Well, let me just tell you something. That must have been one happening Chinese fire drill that morning. You know what I'm saying? What? Going this way, and I got to go sell and so on. So yeah, there were probably a lot of people backtracking and bumping into each other and then bumping into each other again. So now I'm not saying that we shouldn't work, and we can. It's very, very doable to put the resurrection narratives of the four Gospels and even Acts and put it together, and it's entirely coherent. You can trace it, but there are some people bumping into each other. And my point is that even here, Jesus is saying, now, you imagine Mary? This is, and he's saying, now, don't cling to me. That is, I'm not going to be here long. And besides that, I've got a job for you. So I want you to go and tell the apostle, tell the brethren and so on. So, yeah, I again and again, you'll hear me say it. Matter of fact, I said it this morning that there is such a tendency as you read the narratives of Scripture, Old New Testament, to find some spiritual significance in this or that detail. Be careful. I read a guy not too long ago who was dealing with the water to wine. And it says in John 2 that on the third day he came to Cana. And this guy said, well, the reason John says it was on the third day is because he wants us to start thinking about the passion even at the beginning. So the third day is to get you thinking about the 3 days that Jesus, what in the world? You know, what did, yeah, Bowder has something like that, thumb suckinology or something like that. And that's what you're doing, you're just making that up. And besides, when you say that kind of thing, it sounds like it didn't really happen on the third day, but John put that in there to make a point. So he's not telling the truth, but he has a spiritual point. Now, that's a crazy example, but I'm just saying again and again, just celebrate the mundane. It's part of the story, for heavens. And you don't have to think that at every step there is some spiritual connection, because a lot of times there is not. All right, yeah. Ken.
In relations to nations, there's a lot of mention in the Bible about different nations. How do you see the United States today in light of tribulation, in light of the end times, and just where we're at in America? I know I underlined chapter 3 of 2 Timothy, 1 through, I think it was like 9 or 10. I said, boy, that's the United States right now. And I circled that years ago. But a lot of people say, well, there's not much to mention about the United States of America or North America, but we are upside down. I mean, they don't even today know a woman from a man. I mean, this is insane.
We're not much help.
How does this relate to the last days?
Well, listen, the standard reply to that by Friends of Israel, who I worked with for a lot of years, and I think most dispensational, good, solid, pre-trib, pre-mill, straight arrow, know what they're talking about. But the standard understanding is that America is just one of the nations. So they don't stand by Israel and so on. And I think that, but let me just say two things about it, as long as you open a can of worms. Number one, there is a guy, and you could help him find this. And I don't know, maybe you read it, you don't want to share it. But there's a guy named Stephen Anderson, and he has I don't know what he does for a living, but he's on the, he writes on the internet. And I follow him pretty close. I get a lot of help from him. I think it's called The Bible Only. But his name is Stephen Anderson, and he wrote a rather compelling argument. And I can't rehearse it very well for you. That the United States of America is the great harlot of Revelation 17 and 18. And he really made a pretty compelling case. And his primary case was that end time harlot, that it has as hegemony in every way, financially and so on, culturally over the whole world. And there's only been one nation in human history, we're squandering, but that has had that kind of control, not necessarily control, but influence. And I don't know, he had 2 or 3 other arguments. Now, he was speculating, he acknowledged that. But I found it an interesting article, almost primarily at this level, that it seems like given, I mean, okay, we're busy trying to squander every measure of noble influence we have in the world, okay? So maybe by our kids' days, we are totally, we're just a sidelight. We're not even important to what's going on in the world. I don't know, but it's hard to envision. And so my point is that I always found it strange that there was no discernible, not necessarily strange, but maybe that there was no discernible role in the end time drama for the United States. But leave that aside. Let me tell you something else. Let me just explore something with you here. This is not Life of Christ. Well, kind of. Yet to come. You know, have you spent any time in Ezekiel 38? Gog and Magog. Now, everybody has his own idea about how to understand this. And what I'm telling you is basically Joel Rosenberg. I really like Joel Rosenberg, All for Israel and so on. But he suggests that the weird thing about Ezekiel 38, and what you have in Ezekiel 38 and 39 are 10 nations. Oh, they're all Muslim nations today, and they come against Israel at a time when Israel this is what it says, at peace and secure without walls. Well, that's never happened in Israel's history. I've had some people try and tell me it's been recently, but I've been driving through the walls that aren't there, if that's the case, because they're there, trust me. So it's never happened. And what happens is that these 10 nations come down when Israel is secure, and they come down for spoil. Now, this is what I shouldn't go down this road, but this is what put Joel Rosenberg on the map. I don't know, you remember this at all? Because Joel Rosenberg, well, he wrote that book where he had a plane flying into the side of just before it happened, and so that thrust him into. But the other thing is, and he's a tremendous Christian, tremendous student, totally pre-mill, pre-trib, and he got involved in some State Department, and he started making predictions, not predictions so much, but just kind of suggesting. And he would go to the Ezekiel and other passages and say, well, if this is true, if the stage is being set today, this might happen. And he looked at that verse where it says that they come down against Israel for its spoil, and they say, and he said, the curious thing is, there is no spoil in Israel. There's nothing. They don't have many natural resources. They don't have. And so he said, he kind of predicted quietly that Israel would discover oil. Now, they've been looking for oil. People have spent millions of dollars. They've dug in the Negev. And just a few years later, are you familiar with this? They discover the largest reserve of natural oil in the Mediterranean just off their coast. And that kind of got people listening to Joel Rosenberg, did me. And but the point is that, so this is his suggestion, that these 10 nations come down against Israel at a time when they are secure and without walls, and they're about to obliterate Israel, and God delivers them. Now, he's not very specific, but here's the suggestion. God delivers them, and then it takes 7 years to clean up the dead and so on. No, 3.5 years to clean up the dead and so on. All right, now this is a suggestion, and it's only a suggestion, but it's a suggestion that ought to, I don't know, motivate you to keep short accounts, if you know what I'm saying. If Israel is successful in what she is set out to do, and I have pretty confident hopes that the state of Israel is actually going to eradicate the terrorist infrastructure with which she has so foolishly lived for her entire state history. And I've been over there a lot, and when I'm over there, it's always sort of a strange feeling, because there's this simmering anger. There is this large body of religious zealots who live to kill Jews, and they're right in your midst. And turns out they're digging big tunnels under, And so you're thinking, man, this is a landmine, but we just go and everything's fine, Well, on October 7th, that exploded. And so now, for the first time in their history as a nation, they have the kind of internal unification determination. We're going to root this out. You got idiots in D.C. and so on saying knock it off, but they're saying go pound sand. We can't go back. We got whole cities, millions of people who have been evacuated, and we can't take them back there as long as we think October 7th might happen again. So it's not going to happen again. So if Israel is successful, and I think she might be, in absolutely eradicating the terrorist infrastructure that has been a part of her daily existence, it'll be the first time in their history when they live in peace, secure, without walls. Now, that seems to me, very possibly on the basis of Ezekiel 38 and 39, to be what will motivate these. Well, no, I'm going to back up. All right, this is more than you asked for, but I've been doing a lot of thinking about this. This is the way I think it, and nothing of this is original with me. I never had original thought in my life, but I read, and I think this makes good sense, that Israel eradicates the internal infrastructure of terrorism. She is living without peace. And then the rapture. Because we are caught away, and all of a sudden, as Paul says in Thessalonians, the restrainer, and I think you and I are the restrainer, local churches, is caught away. And now those 10 nations who, if it is in fact the stage is being set right now, have been so recently shamed by the Jews because they attacked and they got rebuffed, but now the whole Christian world is absented, and these 10 nations say, oh, now it's wide open. And so now you have the attack of Ezekiel 38, and God raises up a deliverer, and I think it's a pagan, wicked deliverer. Cyrus is a Messiah, the one who delivered them from Persia in Isaiah 44. So now God, this, who knows, it's the Antichrist, I don't know, Jewish, Gentile, I know all the fights and so on, but some statesman is able to marshal a force that's able to rescue Israel. And in so doing, and this is Rosenberg's description, frankly, get after me if you will, I kind of like hearing myself out loud. Islam is wiped off the face of the earth. And guess what? It's pretty easy to make a covenant allowing the Jews to rebuild their temple. And that's when the 70th week begins. I'm persuaded, are you here, Mark, that there is time between the rapture and the actual beginning. The rapture does not begin the 7-year tribulation. It begins the end time drama, but it does not begin. What begins the 70th week, the tribulation, is a covenant between Antichrist and Israel, allowing them to rebuild their temple. And one of the most startling and kind of sobering incidents that are events that have happened in the last 40 years of Israel is this passion to build a third temple. That's all it can talk about. And you heard all the red heifer talk just a little while ago. And so the third temple, folks, is Antichrist temple. There's an outfit that is working to build. It's called the Temple Institute, and they have a shop, and you can go in there and they show you all the things they're building and all the people they're training for the third temple because they know there's going to be a third temple, and there is, and they have nice stuff, and you can buy it there, but it says all proceeds go to the building of the third temple. And I won't buy anything there because I don't want any little plaque on the wall of Antichrist temple. And it says Doug Bookman contributed, so I'm not going near there. But the fact of the matter, what I'm saying, there's not much facts in this, but here's the fact, that Ezekiel talks about a time when they dwell securely. What's going on right now is the first time in their history when it's reason to think that they will dwell securely. And I think once that's in place, everything is ready for the rapture. Now, I don't have a voice in the decision, but if I did, I would ask for there be, a couple, 3 years when we can go back to Israel. You know what I'm saying? Before that happens. I'd like to get back to Israel and be able to walk around when you don't have to worry about all that tension. You know what I'm saying? And I think I will. The rapture come anytime. But so at any rate, just chew on it. But I think there is no doubt that the stage is being set. Amen and amen. And it's curious that at every generation, people say, well, it's never been like this before. And some people say, well, then it's just nonsense. No, that's 2 Peter 3. Where's the promise of coming? On the other hand, God so orders human history that indeed every generation of believers can say, wow, it's never been like this before, because God knows that he who has this hope in himself purifies himself. He is pure. On the other hand, Monk Parker used to say that you have this really, really carefully detailed end-time drama described in Scripture, and it's going to happen on the world. And you can look at the world stage, and you can say, man, the props have never been in place like this. Now, could God rearrange those props for another 500 years? Of course, but don't count on it. And I think you're wise to, I don't know. we gotta live in light of that. I'm sorry. Okay, yeah, brother.
Okay. Is there any evidence that the like the Pharisees or the Sadducees understood the significance of the temple curtain being torn in two at Jesus' death? Or is that, or what that signified?
No, there isn't. It is interesting that I know of, but understand this. And I'm going to get into something. It's really important, but it's a little but almost everything we know about the Jewish attitude of the first century, we know from their literature called the Talmud. The Talmud is Jewish lore and commentary, but you have to understand this, that the Talmud began to be written about 250 to 300 AD. So 250, 300 years into this age. Now, by that time, Jewish thought, and this is incendiary, it's a bit insulting. Jewish thought was all about denying Christianity. And so any remembrance like that, they change. There are times where they have changed their own Talmud. It's like the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's a huge thing, and it's totally impenetrable and so on. And you got all these stages, and it's all this kind of circular writing on it. I mean, you'll have this, Rabbi so-and-so said this, and then Rabbi so-and, Rabbi so-and-so. And so you can get anything you want out of the Talmud. But on the other hand, it was clearly written as an apologetic against Christianity. Does that make sense? So you wouldn't expect that they would acknowledge the significance. Now, it is interesting that there is an offhanded comment that, what's the figure? Oh, that about 40 years before the temple was destroyed, there was a huge effort to repair the veil. They don't mention anything else. They just remember, and it comes out just about right. And the veil, was 60 feet high and 5 animal skins, and took 400 men, according to the Talmud, I don't know, to raise it up and so on. So this is not some gossamer, this is a huge, and it ripped from top to bottom. I didn't mention this morning, but that's one of the ways in which God just put his fingerprint all over this. But, and let me just pick up on that at one point, because I think you might appreciate this, that the Talmud, Jewish literature, is the Judaism of today is the result of the Talmud. I read a fellow, his name is Bloom, and he's Jewish, and I several times I've had access to him, but he says that he gets he's very Jewish, not a believer, not a Christian, but he says he likes to thrill or anger the crowds, the Jewish crowds he's talking to, because he'll tell them, Christianity is older than Judaism. And they go berserk. But what he is saying is, your Judaism was invented in the 3rd century by the Talmudists. And it was by the rabbis who got their names into the Talmud. But it was the intent was to argue against Christianity. And Mike Rydelnik from Moody has a number of places where he can show that the Talmud has been deliberately either altered or, all right, Hebrew it doesn't have vowels, right? Just has the consonants. Now, you can change a position of a vowel and change the meaning of the word. For instance, in Psalm 22, it says, they pierced my hands and feet. If you move the little vowel, it's an A, to a different part of the word, it says, the great lion. And that's the way they read it. Lion, L-I-O-N, animal. The great lion pierced my hand and feet. And what's that mean? That doesn't mean anything. But they can't leave. No, not pierced. Not pierced. It doesn't have that. It doesn't have pierced. It doesn't have the verb. The great lion, hand and feet, something like that. I'm not sure. But, and so the Judaism of today is entirely a function of the Talmud, the rabbis, and it was written deliberately to deny Christianity. That makes sense to you? Now, interestingly, let me tell you one other thing. I say this quickly. There are a couple of scholars, and this was an epiphany to me just a couple of years ago, who are tremendous students of what's called Second Temple Judaism. Now, Second Temple is the days of Jesus, okay? So it's not the 3rd century and later, it's the days of Jesus. And there is a body of literature. It is the Apocrypha, the Jewish Apocrypha, and the scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Huge, what we learn from the scrolls. That's actually contemporary to Jesus and couple other secondary things. And he wrote a book called The Jewish Gospel, this guy's Boyarin, and he's Jewish, and he said he proves from that literature that the rabbis of Jesus' day were preaching that in some mystical way, some very difficult to understand way, there is plurality in the one God, Yahweh. These are Jewish thinkers, and they're saying, and he says, we're going back to our scriptures, and we're discovering that if we're honest, there is some sort of plurality. They call it, there is one who is Yahweh, but is not Yahweh. That's fascinating. But again, all we hear is what, the Jewish, the Talmudic Judaism, and I can't find it anywhere. But if you go back, and this guy says to his Jewish community, you got to quit saying that the Christians are polytheists because they say that Jesus is God and the Father is God, because your scriptures acknowledge that there is some sort of plurality in the Godhead. That makes sense to you? That's kind of big stuff, and I use it just to illustrate that there isn't anything in the Talmud, but we wouldn't expect it. It's not what you signed up for, is it? All right, but we're going to ask over here, and then we'll come here.
Yeah, I just had a couple questions about the physical phenomenon after Christ died,
yeah.
with the graves being open, Old Testament saints walking around. So I think that's just mentioned in Matthew, right?
Only one verse. Matthew
So
27,
you would think
51.
that that's a big thing. Why is that? I mean, I'm assuming other scholars wrote about it as well, or no?
You mean in that age? You mean
In that age, yeah.
Yeah. Well, if they did, we don't have it. All right. You heard the question. Well, what about these people? Well, I'm going to say just a couple things. Number one, understand that this God just is so careful. I can keep saying to put his fingerprints all over this. And there's some really dramatic stuff. Now, Matthew was, by all accounts, there's no question about this. I may have heard of otherwise, but Matthew was the first gospel written. It was the authoritative gospel, in the sense that everybody was kind of building on that. And I think it's the simple explanation is that, and Matthew was the only gospel for about 20 years. Matthew's written, I think, about 43, 44, and Mark, Luke come out about 57, and in John in 90 AD. So for, I say 43, 57, so 15 years or so. And like I say, Paul only had one book to work with all throughout his missionary journeys. So it's established. And clearly Luke, when he writes, he's bouncing off of Matthew and so on. So, and as I said before, every gospel writer knew he was very limited in space. Luke kind of cheated and went to a second volume, but for Acts. But on the other hand, so they're very circumspect about what they write. And I think it's just a settled thing. And there are a lot of other things that Matthew tells us that are never repeated. We don't have any trouble with them. He says it rather incidentally. But remember that Matthew is writing to the generation. Matthew is writing to that generation. In other words, most of the people, or many of the people who read the stories in Matthew, could sit around and say, I remember that. I was there that day. And that makes sense. I think he makes kind of passing, he kind of draws us up short, but he is just listing some of the physical phenomena by which God put his fingerprint and reminded everybody forever that this is not just some normal thing. And people, the most startling, and there's one more problem with that passage in verse 51, is that if you read it wrong, it can be read, and it's not. Believe me, the grammar is quite clear. I don't remember it exactly, but if you read it one way, it seems to say that the saints resurrected on Friday, and they sat around in the graves and twiddled their thumbs until Sunday morning when they went into town, But the way you ought to read it, honestly, is that when Jesus resurrected on that same morning, some graves were open. Matter of fact, graves were opened all over the place. I mean, I'm telling you got the darkness, and then you just all of a sudden, all these big, heavy rolling stones, kerplop, and everybody's scurrying about trying to put their graves back together, and so I think the simple reality is that one of the ways in which God did that is just only told once, but it's told very explicitly that some of the saints who had died. Now I think these were people who had died recently. Otherwise, it would have no apologetic value. You know, if Isaiah came back and said, "Hey, I'm back. I'm Isaiah." Sure, tell me about it. You know, but if on the other hand, Aunt Mary, whom we buried 6 weeks ago, showed up for breakfast that morning, you know that you're gonna. So that's gonna have. So again, I think given the dynamics of the provision of the production of the Gospels and the importance of Matthew and the fact that everybody has very limited space and Matthew's, you know, already recorded this, it's not an event which is picked up by, is repeated by the others, but that takes nothing away from the historical veracity of it. But okay, you had some questions. Oh, no, yeah, good point. Yeah, I ran by that one, didn't I? I said they, how did I say it? They wrote in Greek but thought in Hebrew. And my thought, and the point is that there are so many really remarkable, and remember I told you, I was thinking about this afternoon actually, that because it's an oral language, because you're going to listen and not read, it's absolutely imperative that everything be insinuated into the actual words on the page. And one of the ways that that's done in Hebrew is called the plural of majesty. Are you familiar with that? The word Elohim, im, is plural, so it really means gods, but we translate it God. Because when you want to speak of something that is very special, you would, in many cases, you would just put it in the plural, even though it's a singular noun, and you would use singular verbs and singular adjectives and so on, but the noun would be in the plural. And that would be a way to signify to the listener, no matter, you know, how it was read, that it's a very special thing. And a big illustration of that is Elohim, which means gods. And sometimes it's translated gods appropriately, because sometimes it's referring to, for instance, the pagan gods. But most often it's referring to Yahweh. And so we translate it in the singular, but it's clearly a plural. And another one of those is Sabbath, because sometimes an argument is built with regard to the day of Jesus' death on the basis that the Sabbath is used in the plural. But half the time the word Sabbath appears in the Bible, Old and New Testament, it's not Shabbat, but Shabbaot, which is plural. And it's always just making a point. It's one day, but it's such a special day, you speak of it that way. And that's what I mean by you know, one of my favorites is this, that I don't believe that there is a kingdom here today. I think the kingdom is entirely future. But one of the I think I talked about this. One of the verbs, one of the passages that always appealed to is Colossians 3, where it says, Colossians 1 verse 13, where it says that he has translated us into the kingdom of his dear son. And it's in the past tense, so the kingdom must be here. It says he is translated. Well, in the Hebrew, when God tells the future, he always uses, I talked about this, what's called the perfect. Okay. In Hebrew, you really don't have tense time in the verbs. You have state of being. So it's either complete or incomplete. That's all the choices you got. And it's called perfect or imperfect. Now, there are scores of ways by which they can fine-tune that, but it's either perfect or imperfect. Well, when God, imperfect being incomplete, well, when God tells the future, we do not expect him to use the imperfect. He is going to do something, but he never does. He always uses the perfect, and it's actually called the prophetic perfect. So unto us a child, what? Is born. A son. It's done. But it's not going to happen for 700 years. Well, what's at stake there? It's the prophetic perfect. And what does that mean? That is God's way to make the point that it is as good as done. You can count on it. That's all it means. It's consistent. Nobody denies this. Well, now, Paul, I think, even though he is writing in Greek, thinks in Hebrew. And so he says he has translated us, past tense, into the kingdom of his dear Son. I believe that that's entirely future, but it is as good as done. And by the same token, in a sister verse, because Colossians and Ephesians are very much sister epistles, and in the sister verse in Ephesians 6, it says, no, Ephesians 2, I'm sorry, he has made us sit together with him in heaven. So he's got us in heaven. Now, you guys are enjoying this, but you'd be disappointed, wouldn't you, if you found no. So the point is, we're not in heaven, we're not in a kingdom, but it's, well, another place he says, whom he has justified, he has also glorified. Past tense. How do you feel about that? I'm an old guy. You know, this is good as, I don't want to think this is the glorified. But so anyway, my point is that does that make sense? He uses, and Jesus does the same thing. That's, oh, I know what we were talking about with the today and tomorrow and the third day. And that's a Hebraism that expresses fullness, but he uses it in the Greek language, but he is borrowing it from the Hebrew. That's what I mean. They thought in Hebrew thought forms. And that's why you're so advantaged to just saturate your mind with the Old Testament, because so many ways it's going to be a key to the New Testament.
My other question was, or comment, you said when they had a lamb to be sacrificed, they would calm him down and, you know, love on him, whatever.
Oh, yeah. He had to be with you for 4 days.
Right, and you know, isn't that a picture of Christ? Because it's, he went with all that peace and love. You know, obviously the lamb isn't laying there thinking, hey, the thing's coming down. You know what I mean? But
No, it is. I think it's such a picture. Yeah.
upset because that's kind of fooling that little lamb. You know, but then when the picture came to me, I thought, what a story of beauty.
Yeah. In all the midst of the chaos, and he knowing what's coming, Jesus nonetheless went like a lamb to the slaughter. And it really was a matter of just humane treatment of the animal, that you would, listen, I'm reading that into it. All it says is that for at least 4 days, you have to get the lamb, inspect it after the priest. I don't think it has to happen on the 10th of Nisan, because it couldn't, but it had to happen by the 10th of Nisan. And after that, you had to keep it more like a pet. And I think the primary reason was because with all the chaos, he was going to trust you. So you are kind of, but that's what lamb was made for.
I have a quick question for you,
Good.
and then one final. We got to be done. It's after 6, and I'd love to keep doing this all night. I don't know about you. All right, Doug, did the Sanhedrin know that Jesus was Messiah?
Listen, you know, when Jesus, and I mentioned this in passing, when Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And I'm troubled by that, because there are elements of the story, and the two I always think of, we talked about this before, is first of all Jesus' parable of the husband of the guy who owned a vineyard, and he let it out to the husbandman, and he sent his servant, then another servant, and then it says at the last he sent his son, his well-beloved son, his only son, if you put all the gospels together, and when he did, you remember that the wicked husbandman looked at the man and said, this guy claims to be the son, but we don't believe him, so no. They said, this is the heir. Let us kill him and claim the inheritance for ourselves. Well, that seems to suggest that they knew what they were doing. And then you put that together with a very parallel story, I think, which is, we talked about a little bit, is Caiaphas, after the raising of Lazarus, when some of the people who witnessed the raising come to Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin and tell him about it, and he says, what are we going to do? This man does many signs. Now we say there's a biblical answer to that question. And the answer is, first of all, it's really kind of two-step. You go to the scriptures and you make sure he's not denying anything in scripture. That's Deuteronomy 13. And if he's not, then you bow the knee. That's the way you answer that question. This man does many signs. He's speaking for God. But their answer is, if we don't kill him, the Romans are coming to our place and our nation. And from that moment, John 11:53, they determined to put him to death. So on the one hand, here's Tevye, but on the one hand, I think there is good reason to believe that in many cases, especially the leadership, and you asked about the Sanhedrin, uh, it wasn't confusion, all right? It was rebellion. It was selfish rebellion. On the other hand, Jesus says they know not what they do, and Peter says this same thing in Acts, isn't it, chapter 2? If you had known, you and your rulers, you would not. No, that's Paul in 1 Corinthians 3. Had they known, they would have not crucified. And in Acts 2, Peter says the same thing. I know out of ignorance, you and your rulers. Now, let me just tell you, this is how I solve that, not very well, but that question. I rather think that the really tough bone in the throat of so many was Jesus' claim to be God. It's just so unspeakably difficult for a Jewish thinker to accept that. And I think this is what troubled a man named Saul, who is, and he says in 1 Timothy that he received mercy because he did it ignorantly. Now, what he meant by that, he honestly, I think what he means is he was troubled. He couldn't come to grips until he actually encountered the resurrected Jesus on the road to Damascus, and he finally bowed the knee to it. But however you like it, Jesus' claim to be God seems to me to be so terribly, terribly difficult to believe that on the one hand, there were those who just high-handed. I think Caiaphas, he knew exactly what the truth was, and he just absolutely defied it. But I think many others, and you even have it, and then you remember Joseph. It was Joseph, or there were others in the Sanhedrin who were believers, but they didn't speak openly and so on because of. So I guess what I'm saying is, here's what we need to understand, and I think that the tension that we're talking about here in the narrative, at least reinforces, if not gives voice to this, and that is this: on the one hand, Jesus was not rejected corporately or individually because he didn't make a sufficient case for himself. It's in that sense that every mouth was stopped. Jesus proved. You know, I like to say, just real quickly, all throughout it, I mentioned this, Jesus claimed to be the Christ, God come in the flesh. Those are stunningly difficult to believe. They are incredible. But if you don't believe them, you're lost. So it seems to me that God is under some sort of moral obligation to make those incredible claims, now hear me, not only credible, worthy of belief, but compelling. So obviously worthy of belief that if you don't believe him, God can justly condemn you forever. So Jesus says, I'm God, I'm Christ, I'm the Messiah, God come in the flesh. That's incredible. What did God do? He took 2 steps, and I can find only 2 steps. One is the prophecies. The prophecies were so stunning. And so if you do the Berean thing, what do the Bereans do? Paul comes and tells them about this Messiah. They search the scriptures. And if you do, you're going to find out all of those prophecies, they couldn't be counterfeited. There's no way they could be an accident. This is God. So first of all, you have the prophecies, and secondly, you have the miracles. Everywhere Jesus went, he did these miracles. And miracles are God's way to prove through a man's claim to be a divine messenger. So in that context, I would say, or given all of that, Jesus did not insufficiently make the case for his messiahship in any way. But on the other hand, his claims were so bottomlessly difficult. And they were expensive. I mean, it was going to cost you something to embrace it. And so that generation at various levels of commitment, some influenced by others and some doing the influencing, that generation, when they were given the choice, and it's basically Jesus or Barabbas, they made a conscious choice. And so, yeah, it's yeah, go ahead.
Okay, last question and this is more informational. Assuming you're able to go back to Israel, how would these people go with you? Would that be a possibility? What does that look like?
Listen, in a sentence, God has, and let me tell you something, this is providentially so ridiculous, because for me to lead anybody, I am the most directionally challenged guy on the face of the earth. It's ridiculous. You take me in the backyard, spin me around a couple, I can't find a house, you know. But I've learned to do this, and it's a long story of sweet providences. So I do take people to Israel, and I do it on my own. I don't have an agency. I'm the guide. I do all the guiding. I have a guide because you have to have a guide, but he's just a friend of mine who he's also our bus driver. And so I'd love to arrange a trip. Now, I have given up on 2024. I'll tell you this, if you're at all interested, I'm putting together right now a couple of trips that I need to get back to Israel. It's driving me crazy. And I'm calling them, are you ready for this? Caveat rich trips. So we're going to plan, but given what's going on over there, it may get 2 weeks early. I got to pull out. Now, I'll tell you this. When I build a trip, I don't spend a dime until I get to Israel. So you send me the money for the trip, and you don't go, I mean, you get a cough that morning and say, I don't think I'm going to get all your money back, okay? I don't keep any of your money, so nothing's at risk. On the other hand, you're going to have to you have to get an air flight, and, best of luck to you. Do everything you can to protect that. But, so what I'm saying is I'm going to put a trip together this year. I'm working on it right now. I've contacted, I do all my own hotels. They're all guys I love, and I've known them over the years and so on. And like I say, the bus driver is a personal friend of mine who is, by the way, not only a licensed bus driver, but a licensed guide. And not only that, but he is a believer and a pastor and a church planter. So he's a dear friend of mine and lives in Jerusalem. So he drives the bus for us. Oh, he's a great guy. You love him. And so I put it together and arrange the hotels, and we do it on our own. And the trips are almost always 10 days in the land, 10 days when you get up in the morning, go to bed at night in the land. I've worked very hard. They are study trips, and they're not everybody can handle it. We walk 7 or 8 miles a day a lot of times, never over, good terrains, always up or down and rocky and so on. And we work hard. But the reason I go is they're genuine study trips. We study the land. I give you reams of material. You are free to you. You can look at. You can have those anyway. But I got a whole website where you can find all sorts of things to prepare. I put together a booklet of about 120 pages of my own that we go through, and I got charts and diagrams and all that sort of stuff. So I work very hard. I say that there are 3 things that mark a study trip. Number 1 is pre-study. You got to be study. And number 2 is some restrictions, because you got to be able to walk. We can't, and now we can fudge, but you got to be able to walk. And number 3, no shopping. We don't do any shopping. Now that's not, you can't do shopping, but we never stop to shop, okay? We got too much to do. Now, let me just tell you, this takes some work, because the bus drivers make more on the commission from your shopping than they do on the driving. And so I build it in. We pay him handsomely because we got to make up for that. But he's happy. We don't shop. Most trips, at least once every 2 days, you pull up in front of a souvenir shop. It's about twice as big as this building. And there's a door here, and then here's the bus door, and you take 1 step and you walk in it, and then they lock the door. And you're in there until they get done with it, And we don't do any of that. We never do that. There are places where we say there's a shop here if you want to take a few minutes. We're not going to slow down. But so at any rate, I'd love to do it. And we just find a church, and maybe if 2 churches can fit in 1 bus, which a lot of times is the case, we take So yeah, we love to talk about it. Our trips right now. All right, get to the nitty gritty here. Right now, and prices are going up precipitously, I'm telling you. And here's the thing, we don't do air. I don't want anything to do with air. You get your own air. There's only 1 international airport in Israel. It's tough to get this wrong. If you fly to Israel, you're getting off in Tel Aviv, and you get a cab, and you go to the hotel where we all meet. It's a lovely, there's a lot going on with that. But before, I had 10 trips arranged for this year. They all went up in smoke. But the prices, my land only price is somewhere around 33 to 35. Now, that's everything except lunches and travel from and to the airport. And because you're on your own for the travel. But and by the way, most of the time churches will get together and just informally somebody will say, "Okay, go on here. Let's all buy it, so you can come together and so on." And that's the small print. But that's everything except lunches. You got to buy your own. Because if I try and include the price of lunch, then I got to go someplace where there's a voucher, and I don't want to do that. We just stop along the way. Nice place, you'll love them, and you pay for your own lunch. But otherwise, everything is covered. Tips. I mean, you want to do a nice tip along the way, help yourself. But we cover the bus tips. We cover that bus driver, the hotel tips. I don't want to play the game where they're following you around and so on. So I just tell them, listen, the tips are settled, and so don't be, jerking around with my people. But so yeah, I love doing it. Any of you who's been to Israel? Nobody's ever been with me, have you? Listen, abandoning every pretense and any sort of humility. Everybody who takes people to Israel thinks they do it better than anybody else. Okay, should I be an exception for them? But I love doing it. I love teaching the Bible. There's no better place in the world. And folks, honest to goodness, I think there may be a season on the near horizon when Israel is more accessible, more quiet. One of the places, I take people places most people don't go, and it's been my habit for years because Joel Kramer taught me to go to Sychar, because that well is still there. You draw water from the well that Jesus drew from, but it's in Shem, it's in Shechem, so most people won't go near it. I love to go to Shechem. It's been so tense, and I don't know. My prayer and somewhat hope is somewhere in the next several months, Israel will have enough. It will establish enough security that travel in Israel will be more delightful and more trouble-free than it has been since 1948. I mean, it's I don't know. Start saving up, for heaven's sakes. It's not with me. Get over there. All right.
All right. Have you been encouraged with Dr. Bookman this weekend?
Yeah.
I hope you have.
Amen.
I hope you have.
Thank you.
Praise the Lord.